Alrighty, we are live. Great.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the misuse of Holocaust and Nazi analogies in American politics. I welcome the people who are joining us this afternoon in the room with us at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, and I welcome Dr. Rosenfeld in his office in Connecticut, and and also welcome the people who are watching this online and those of you who may be watching it sometime in the future. I'm glad to be here today with Frank Hornstein, who worked with us over the last year developing this webinar and doing a study on this topic, and I'm sure we have a very lively conversation to look forward to. I'm director of the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship here at Augsburg College, and we are very interested and concerned about civil discourse, so this topic is near and dear to our work. And from here, I will turn it over to Frank.
Thank you. Well, I want a big thank you to Elaine here at Augsburg and all of the staff at Augsburg who have helped put this together. It's been a wonderful experience to work here on a very timely topic, which is the use of Nazi analogies and Holocaust analogies in American political discourse. And in the process of taking a look at this issue, I had the opportunity to look at some of the academic work and writings of different folks who have examined this topic. And naturally, the name that comes up most often in these conversations is Dr. Gabriel Rosenfeld, who is a professor of Judaic Studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut. And one of the things that I think is so significant about Dr. Rosenfeld's work and why I wanted him to be really the lead in terms of leading a discussion on this topic is that he has examined this from a historical perspective and really delved deeply into the topic of normalization of the Holocaust in American pop culture. But of course, that's now connected very much to our political environment. And we have to look no further than the discourse in the presidential election, not simply Donald Trump, but others who have used various Holocaust analogies and Nazi comparisons over time. So what we would like to do today, and I'd like to again thank everybody for joining us, is to have Dr. Rosenfeld begin with a brief overview of the concepts of normalization, why they are significant, why they're important as we explore Holocaust memory. Then Dr. Rosenfeld and I will engage in a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the entire group for some questions and answers. And we'll be maybe going a couple minutes over time, 3 o'clock Central, 4 o'clock Eastern, because of our delay in setting this up, but not much after that. I think we'll go till about 5 after 4 Eastern time. So with that, Dr. Rosenfeld, thank you so much, your generosity with your time and helping us prepare for this. I know that this is a timely topic, and we really appreciate your involvement with us. So I'd like to just hand it over to Dr. Rosenfeld.
Thank you very much, Frank, for the invitation. For those of you that don't know, Frank and I met about a year ago, if I'm not mistaken,
yes,
here in the area. And I was interested to get his email inquiring about the question of Nazi analogies and political discourse. And we've been in touch in recent months over email and over the phone. And so it's a nice opportunity for me to finally get to move beyond just a one-on-one dialogue, but to get into a larger community setting and to see what kinds of questions people might have. So to get into the larger theory that I think much of what we're going to talk about is going to revolve around, there's this concept of normalization that I think is worth me saying one or two things about before we get into the actual concrete question of Nazi analogies. Because the question of normalization is very much around us everywhere. Probably many of you are familiar and have been seeing articles in the news about some journalists saying we can't normalize the Trump presidency. We can't normalize the new political direction that the country's going in, because that would be taking something that is the opposite of normal and getting used to it. And for people who, and this is obviously a political question, but for people who are very concerned about normalization, the term itself has a lot of worrisome connotations to it. But I want to make clear right from the outset that what I'm talking about in the case of normalization is not normalizing a present day political situation, but normalizing historical memory. By that I mean the past as we understand it today. It could be any past. It could be the Civil War, the American Revolution, the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Any historical legacy can be viewed from multiple perspectives. And I think it's safe to say that most pasts, most historical occurrences are not created equal. So to give you an example, we've had 44 presidents. We'll soon have a 45th. And probably, I'd hazard to say, very few of us in the room could distinguish much between the administration of Millard Fillmore or Martin Van Buren, because those administrations were more or less run-of-the-mill, ordinary, that's to say normal. And you know, most historical events are viewed from a perspective of normalcy by most people with a certain degree of dispassion and equanimity and so forth. But then there are, of course, those historical legacies that are exceptional. So if you think about the administration of Abraham Lincoln or the administration of FDR, people view those administrations in much more exceptional terms because pivotal events took place, pivotal decisions were made, and usually those decisions leave us with a moral legacy. So we learn lessons from the Lincoln administration, from the Roosevelt administration. We learn lessons about things that we should do, things that we should emulate, and things maybe that we would want to avoid. And so in the context of European history, of course, the Nazi period has always been viewed as an exceptional period because of all the extreme criminality that defined it. And ever since the end of World War II in May of 1945, all kinds of historians have hoped, at least, that people would learn the lessons of the Nazi past, would meditate upon the moral issues that were involved in that time period, and would not just view that past like a past like any other. Normalization is what happens when an exceptional past becomes, in fact, treated like a past like any other. So that we wouldn't necessarily think that to view the Nazi period is that much more incumbent upon us from a moral perspective than, you know, the era of Martin Luther or the era of Frederick the Great in the 18th century. And so normalization is alarming for some observers. And here I'm drawing on the fact that normalization is a very, very current topic among academics in the fields of German studies, Holocaust studies, memory studies. Normalization is a very concerning phenomenon because it kind of presumes that people aren't going to pay attention much to a certain historical legacy at a certain juncture. Maybe they become exhausted of the topic. Maybe they just don't think it's a repository of moral lessons anymore. But eventually they just start treating it like a past like any other. And that can be a source of concern. And so the book that I published last year, it's called Hi Hitler, makes the argument that in the last, 15 years since the turn of the millennium, we've been witnessing an acceleration in what I call the pace of normalization, insofar as the way Hitler is being portrayed in the mass media and in academic scholarship, the way the Nazi period, the way the Holocaust is being portrayed, even the way World War II is being portrayed. There's a less there's a less of a sense of needing to view it as a source of moral lessons and a growing desire to normalize it according to a variety of different strategies. And I just want to add one or two words about the ways in which normalization takes place and the factors that tend to shape it, and maybe offer an explanation as to why in the last 15 years since 9/11, since the turn of the millennium, why we're witnessing an acceleration of normalization. And I guess the larger point for our discussion might be, how should we interpret this? Is it really that worrisome? Is it something we can expect to continue? But just to give you a bit of a more sense as to what normalization is caused by, there's usually four factors that are easy to identify. And the first is simply what we can call the process of organic normalization. By that I simply mean what happens when time passes and when there's generational turnover, and when the eyewitnesses to a certain historical experience, like the Second World War or the Holocaust, when they get older and when they die off and when they're replaced by younger people from new generations who have no personal experiences with the past, obviously the younger people have a less morally engaged, oftentimes, view of the past. Those who experienced it firsthand feel much more sensitive about playing fast and loose with different ways of representing the past. And so, in the early years after World War II, when the proportion of people who lived through the events of the Holocaust were, dominant in terms of their numerical majority, you weren't going to see some of the normalizing tendencies that you see today when it's teenagers and 20-somethings who might play very flippantly with images of Hitler online and who don't feel the same kinds of taboos or the same kinds of sensitivities about, viewing the past with a certain amount of respect and deference. So invariably, I think the more that the past retreats into the past, the more we're going to view it from a more normalized perspective. And that's something that can't be halted. It's simply in the nature of time passing. But that's just the first of the 4 strategies that we need to understand, because the last 3, and Frank, this is where we're going to get into some material I think that is very relevant to our discussion. The other 3 strategies are much more intentional. They're much more deliberate. They reflect the tendency on the part of some people to want to forcibly normalize the past, to accelerate its normalization, and to kind of be done with it from a sense of just being impatient. So the 3 other strategies are what we call universalization, relativization, and aestheticization. So to put it in more layperson's terms, the past can be relativized, it can be universalized, and it can be aestheticized. And each of these these 3 strategies are deliberate ways of trying to force the past into a new status of normalcy. And I can give you some examples of what I mean by this. Universalization involves taking a historical legacy and trying to inflate its significance in order to draw attention to other non-related events, but events that people are by definition concerned about. So to give you 2 concrete examples, when George W. Bush, after 9/11, issued the Patriot Act and was starting to curtail civil liberties in the country, a lot of people on the left very much were concerned that this was one step down the path towards fascism, because if we're seeing something like that going on in the US, where there could be new methods of eavesdropping on private conversations, then this is clearly an example of what Hitler did with the Reichstag fire decrees in early 1933. And it's an effort to, in a sense, compare the Nazi period to something going on today. Even if the comparisons are valid to some extent, they may be stretched to another extent. And oftentimes what happens is that the exceptionality or the particularity of the Nazi experience gets diluted. Or contrast that with what a lot of Tea Party supporters did when they marched on Washington in 2009-10 to protest Obamacare, which they compared to the Nazi T4 euthanasia campaign, because remember, there was the idea that there would be death panels where children could make sure that their parents or grandparents were given euthanasia death treatments. And of course, this was all moderately hysterical at the time as well, but it's another way of right-wingers in this instance universalizing the Nazi period by drawing too many parallels, alleged parallels, between what happened in the 30s and what might be happening today. And these kind of comparisons are always alarmist, and they oftentimes play fast and loose with the comparisons. Those are both examples of universalization. So again, inflate and direct attention to one's own pet concerns by making Nazi analogies. Relativization is very different. Relativization oftentimes involves trying to minimize the Nazi past deliberately in order to oftentimes pursue a certain kind of nationalistic agenda. So to give you an example, in the 1980s, when the Germans under Helmut Kohl were trying to revive a healthier sense of German national identity and make sure that the prospects for unification were kept open, there were a lot of comparisons during the years 86 and 87 during the famous historians debate. A lot of efforts by historians to try and make the case that, well, the Holocaust, what the Germans did to the Jews, was not unique in history. It was not anything that exceptional, because after all, the Cambodians had a genocide, the Armenians and the Turks were involved in the genocide, and the list went on. And it's not to say that those comparisons can't be useful, it can't be important, but if you're deliberately trying to minimize the uniqueness of a historical event by comparing it to many others in order to make your own country's history not look that bad, that's what we call relativization. And that's not only, by the way, a right-wing or conservative phenomenon, it can also exist on the left in the following sense. There are people, of course, who have tried to take the idea of American exceptionalism, or the idea of the British in World War II having their finest hour in standing up to Nazis and standing up to the Nazis. Those are badges of honor, badges of pride that a lot of patriotic Britons or Americans would say distinguishes their national histories. Well, if you're a more left-leaning, liberal, critical person who wants to air out one's country's dirty laundry, it might be in your interest to try and relativize this triumphalistic view of your own history by pointing out all the dark sides of your past or all the skeletons that might be lying in the closet. So relativization is all about minimizing the significance of a certain era. It can be done from a left-wing or a right-wing perspective, and those are the counterparts to what we just described as universalization. I imagine that those will be the 2 key strategies we'll be discussing today in terms of Nazi analogies, but it is worth also noting that aestheticization plays into this phenomenon of normalization as well in one final sense. Any form of representing the past, whether it's in the form of a novel or a film or a website, it always involves strategies of aesthetic representation. So film directors, writers, poets, you name it, they're always using certain aesthetic strategies in the process of trying to represent what happened in the past. If the aesthetic strategies end up becoming the chief priority, and if they tend to overwhelm the actual moral lessons that are supposed to be portrayed in a work of art or literature or film or drama or whatever, then we say that the past is, the moral aspects of the past are being diluted, and the focus ends up being on the surface aesthetics and on the gestures and on the modes of representation. And so when you see internet memes today of Hitler that are playing him for laughs, or some of the downfall parody videos that are treating him as a source of humor or as the butt of jokes, obviously it's safe to say Hitler and his criminality is being lost sight of for the sake of making an aesthetic comment, an aesthetic gesture of one kind or another. That may be entertaining and may get a lot of web clicks, but it's losing sight once again of the moral exceptionality of this particular past. So just to kind of wrap up, all of these strategies, organic normalization, relativization, aestheticization, universalization, they're all boiled down to the common denominator of making sure that the past that used to be viewed from an exceptional moralistic perspective ends up being just kind of flattened and normalized and treated as a past like any other.
So thank you very much. Dr. Rosenfeld and I sort of discussed a couple of questions that I would start off asking him, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group. But one, I think this is very much on people's minds right now.
Yes.
And that has to do with our current political situation. And obviously, you know, in this last presidential campaign, there were lots of examples of normalization, I would argue. You know, at one time, you know, when Huckabee was still in the race, he said that the Iran deal, for example, would be tantamount to marching Jews into the ovens again. Ben Carson at one time said that the Holocaust would have been avoided if there hadn't been, if Jews were given guns, that gun control essentially caused the Holocaust. And then, of course, we have this other, you know, the Trump phenomenon, which, you know, there's many different aspects to this happening. So I guess I wanted to just get your sense on, you know, why are these kinds of analogies problematic in politics? And do you feel that this is a new kind of form of normalization when, you know, these analogies are used in political discourse? I hear it all the time as an elected official. Mm-hmm. And I can recite to you chapter and verse of everywhere from the floor of the Minnesota House of Representatives to the floor of Congress, you know, again, from the left, from the right. You know, the Affordable Care Act is Nazi Germany is, you know, one that came up repeatedly. But, you know, I'm interested in your take on how this is impacting our political discourse, as Elaine said.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's any number of things one could say here. I mean, I think the larger question is, how did we get here? Right? How did we get to the point where the Nazis are used as a trump card in any historical debate or political debate? You know, for better or worse, because the Nazis represent the low point of Western civilization in the 20th century, and because they still represent, and Hitler personified represents, the epitome of evil still for what our culture, as far as our culture is concerned at least. It's an easy way to stigmatize your opponent by linking him or her to Hitler or a policy that somebody might advocate to Hitler. The problem, of course, is that we end up cheapening the political dialogue and cheapening political discourse because, honestly, it's like taking a machine gun to, you know, kill a spider in your house. I mean, the weaponry is so out of proportion, oftentimes, to the alleged danger that is being faced, that it gets people, in my opinion, oftentimes to tune out entirely. As soon as people resort to playing the Hitler card, or as soon as they invoke Nazi analogies, it oftentimes leads people to suspect that somebody's crying wolf. It's an easy way to get attention, of course, for your pet issue, to invoke the Nazis. But if everything is easily comparable to the Nazis, well then, you know, either we're in a hellish situation, but you know, when the sun rises the next morning and when life goes on and when the world didn't end and the sky didn't fall, people are sort of going to ask themselves, have we been had by all the discourse and all the rhetoric that's been swirling around a certain issue? So my fear is that people end up tuning out anytime somebody invokes the Nazis, because more often than not, it's a grossly exaggerated comparison, but it's a constantly tempting comparison to make because of the fear that some people have that if they don't invoke the Nazis, then they won't be paid attention to, because the default mode of drawing attention to something these days is in fact to invoke Hitler, to invoke Auschwitz, to invoke the Second World War, to invoke the Holocaust. And if somebody were to complain about Obamacare by saying, well, this sounds like something that Huey Long would have done, or this sounds like something George Wallace would have proposed, unfortunately, many people's historical literacy is such today that a lot of historical analogies will simply fall on deaf ears. So I think the fear is that if you're going to make a historical analogy at all, you better resort to the big guns, you better resort to Hitler, and that ends up being reproduced time and time again, and we start tuning it out, we become desensitized to it, and that's why you have this internet law known as Godwin's Law that, Frank, I think you and I spoke about when we met back in Connecticut, the idea that the longer historical debate drags on, the higher the odds that somebody will invoke Hitler before too long. And when Godwin's Law is confirmed time and time and time again, it also brings up a corollary that's known as Dodd's corollary, which says whoever brings up Hitler first in a debate automatically loses the debate, because it's a sign of intellectual superficiality, it's a sign of a lack of depth of historical knowledge. Frankly, I'd be thrilled if we had more historical literacy in the countries that people could rely on a general audience understanding who Huey Long or George Wallace was, or any other person on the right who might be invoked, or for that matter, people on the left who, if you don't like leftists, you could invoke somebody, from the Soviet experience like Bukharin, or, Stalin's an easy second to Hitler, so I don't think he's that much of an original choice either. But you get my point here. I think, obviously, much of this is about rhetoric, and I think in this recent election cycle, we've been so drowned by rhetoric, and we've had so little discussion of actual substance, and we've had, Donald Trump's scandal du jour, where it was impossible to keep track of what the daily scandal was, because there was something that was probably inevitably going to surface the next day, or some rhetorical exaggeration that was going to be pounced on by the media. And because I think our short attention spans in an internet age, where the ordinary person lasts on a website for 12 seconds before they click elsewhere, we were having this race to the bottom in terms of rhetoric trumping substantial debate. And I think Hillary Clinton was at a real disadvantage in that regard, because she's great from a policy wonk perspective, but she's not a dynamic speaker in the same way that others are. And this is, I guess, what we could call asymmetrical warfare to an extent.
So one then additional question, and then we'll open it up. You argued about a year ago in an article in the New Yorker, and this was, I think, when Donald Trump's candidacy was just, I think, in the early stages of his ascendance, but certainly ascendance, and
yes,
people were starting to, draw some analogies between him and America and Weimar Germany, et cetera. But you argued we ought to look to our own history and own examples of history, xenophobia, the Japanese internment camps, the exclusion acts, our own experience. Of course, here in Minnesota, we're very cognizant of the indigenous genocide that took place and continues to. So I guess talk a little bit more about your thoughts about that aspect of going to Nazi Germany when, in fact, we have our own historical experiences here. You touched on this earlier, and I think you make a very interesting point about we go there, but we have our own analogies here that we can be using.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to your question is implied in your question. It's an absolutely valid point. That one reason why it's very tempting to point to Hitler is that it's their history, it's the Germans' history, it's not our history. And I think for even people who, like on the right, like Bret Stephens for the Wall Street Journal, by focusing on the fact that Donald Trump is starting to beat the drums of ethno-nationalism in ways that echo from the 1930s with Mussolini and Hitler, I mean, I think to some extent it's easier for the Republican Party to abstain from looking at itself in the mirror to see where this Republican nominee came from. I mean, there's a long history, and it's not exclusive to the Republican Party, God knows, of right-wing nativism being part of the political culture, whether it's George Wallace, whether it's Pat Buchanan, whether it's recent nominees who have catered to the same constituents who are now voting for Trump. I think it's a way of distracting attention from how Donald Trump is a homegrown phenomenon. He is not an import from Germany. And I think that bait and switch, by focusing on the Nazi comparisons, if they're coming from the conservative wing of the spectrum, as they have to some extent, then that's one way of sort of abstaining from looking at one's own culpability in the rise of this particular phenomenon, which is not to say, of course, that he is a fascist or that America today is Weimar Germany. Obviously, the political left has its own skeletons in its closet, so FDR's ill-advised decision to intern Japanese Americans, and the Supreme Court's going along with it, that was certainly not coming from the far right. That was coming from a left liberal president. And there's certainly things that we could look back to in our history as Americans that we would like to do differently. And I think, again, it would be incumbent upon us to make comparisons that draw from our own history. But in politics, the past is oftentimes a political hot potato, and we don't want to touch it. We want to throw it back to the other side, make them responsible for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see the honest comparisons and the honest analogies, the ones that might be actually much more appropriate. But again, much of this is not about academic truth and finding the best comparisons. It's about rhetorically trumping your opponent and getting leverage. So I think most sides are fighting to a draw when liberals today are talking about the Nazi parallels and the fascist parallels. And when the conservatives were saying the same thing about Obama, we end up fighting to a draw to a certain extent because we're both using the same trump cards and the same weapons. And every time that the Nazi past part, or I should call it the Fourth Reich, every time the Fourth Reich doesn't dawn, we can breathe a sigh of relief, but it then makes it sort of frustrating for those of us who actually study the Nazi period, because why will anyone ever bother to go down these paths of historical comparisons again if people are so mismanaging the comparisons and abusing them and distorting them? And I'm not saying any of this from the perspective of just needing to insulate the Nazi experience so that nobody ever makes a comparison again. That would be the last thing I'd want to do. But I think the way that comparisons have to be made is methodically and carefully. But in a tweeting culture where everything's 140 or 120 characters or whatever it is on Twitter, or when you need to make sure that you hold people's attention on the websites that you're writing on, people are going to play fast and loose with the facts. And we all know how we're theoretically living in a post-fact, post-truth society where everything's spin and everything is manipulation and rhetoric. So unfortunately, the biggest guns in the arsenal are the ones that usually people grab first, and those tend to be the Nazi guns.
Thank you. So in the approximately half hour that we have left, I would just like to open it up for questions from folks here in the room. I don't know if we have a way to get questions online, but...
or you can repeat them maybe.
Okay, so if people have a question for Dr. Rosenfeld, you can just ask it and I'll repeat it so that everyone can hear it.
Or if it's easier to write it down and then pass it back to Representative Hunstein.
So any questions here from Minneapolis? Yes,
I have one. So Dr. Rosenfeld, you mentioned that you didn't want to rule out making comparisons, and so I'm wondering if you've read in your own reading of articles or analysis of the current political situation, if you've read any comparisons that you thought were legitimate.
So I don't know if you heard the question, but and this is a very important question. Particularly post-election, are there times when comparisons are called for, are valid, can stand up to some of the criteria that we're using today? But when are these comparisons valid, and when can they be used?
Right, no, for sure. I mean, I think number one, the most important thing that helps us distinguish a valid from an invalid comparison is the intention that lies behind it. So if there are ulterior motives, if there are merely partisan efforts to, again, score points, cheat points, and discredit somebody by making an egregious comparison that one knows will never really be fact-checked necessarily, then I think that those are bad faith comparisons. I would certainly prefer good faith comparisons that are not so much pursuing partisan agendas, but that are pursuing actually the truth of the matter, if one can speak of such a thing. So to give you an example, one of the things that I think we've heard a lot of political analysts talk about in the recent election returns is that, well, a lot of voters voted for Trump either because of his racial dog whistles or despite his racial dog whistles. And that's the same thing that, of course, people asked about Hitler back in the early 1930s. Did Germans vote for him despite his anti-Semitism or because of his anti-Semitism? And the initial thought was a lot of people were voting for Hitler not because they were dyed-in-the-wool Nazis. And all the political scientists, by the way, and the political historians who have studied the voting bases of the Nazi Party as they evolved throughout the 20s and 30s have really, at a granular level, determined which different bases voted for the Nazis when, who their core voters were, who their more thinly allied voters were, and so forth. But one of the consensus conclusions that's come from this scholarship is that Hitler, who never got more than 43.9% of the vote in any semi-free election, he was brought into power by Hindenburg, of course, who appointed him chancellor, but the reason he appointed him was that he was getting more votes than any other potential chancellor candidate in the country. And one of the reasons he was getting more votes was that many, many Germans had lost so much faith in the liberal parliamentary system that they were just engaging in what we call protest voting. And the obvious parallel, of course, here is that a lot of people, especially the Obama voters who apparently switched from 2012 or 2008 from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the last 8 years, well, they're clearly protesting a whole host of things that they're resentful about. And they can be material concerns having to do with declining standard of living and lack of jobs and free trade and, you know, all the problems of NAFTA and TPP and so forth. Or it could be racial resentments, resentments against immigrants coming from Syria, fears of immigrants coming from the Middle East. It can be fears about or resentments about identity politics. But the point is, whatever the actual issues are that motivate or animate people in the way that they're voting, it isn't necessarily the case that they voted for Donald Trump because they supported everything he was advocating. It's that they're trying to flip the bird to the American political system, to the so-called Washington insider establishment. And I think the clear comparison that we need to keep in mind is that all the Germans who voted in a similar protest fashion in the 1930s, they were content to junk the system, to shake it up, to bring about some results. And unfortunately, the person they brought into power had a very, very clear political and ideologically driven agenda to torpedo democracy writ large. And there's absolutely zero evidence that that's the same thing for Donald Trump. I think the fact that we have 240 years of democracy in our country that we can look back upon with, a certain amount of pride for sure, with a lot of misgivings and other aspects to be sure also. But, the German experience with democracy was much, much shorter, much more shallow. Democracy was much less firmly embedded in German political culture, and most historians who study this have argued that it was easier to kind of toss aside democracy through a protest vote than it might be for us in this country. So that kind of a comparison, I think, is very useful, because while protest votes can be a good way of expressing discontent, protest votes also represent, a fever that is a sign that the body politic is sick and needs to be cured. That's one example of a kind of comparison: protest votes in one era, protest votes in another era, where the Nazi analogy has been perfectly legitimate. And there are many other examples as well that I could talk to, but some historians have already been pointing to these comparisons and have, I think, in the process of doing so, have provided a useful service.
Yes.
Yes, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm thinking about Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jew, who conceived of the word genocide. Before World War I, he studied the Armenian genocide of World War I, and he lived in Poland before World War II, and he came to the conclusion that when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, that he was planning a similar genocide against the Jews, as the Turks had in World War I against the Armenians. So I'm thinking that Raphael Lemkin was a very good scholar, and if we want to determine as to whether there might be any tendencies in this country at this time towards genocide or persecution. We want to study him from a scholarly point of view.
So you want I can translate it. So I don't know how much of that you heard, but you know, one of our participants here was talking about Lemkin, the Polish scholar who I believe you know, helped to uncover the you know, Hitler's study of the Armenian genocide, and you know, warning that you know, perhaps these past genocides could inform potential future genocides. And is there any need or reason to, you know, reflect or study that in the context of our current political system? I think that I'm summarizing the question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a vast literature on the question of when the final solution of the Jewish question, as far as Hitler and the Nazis conceived of, but when it really turned into mass murder, or what Lemkin later called genocide. By far and away, the consensus of historians today is that when Hitler came to power in 1933, he probably wanted to solve the Jewish question in as wholesale a fashion as possible, but that the concept of gas chambers and crematoria was probably still far off in the distance. That's something that evolved during the course of World War II itself. But that's not to say that Hitler didn't want a wholesale solution to remove Germany's Jews from the country altogether. Most historians argue that still on the eve of World War II, the preferred policy was probably forced emigration, mass expulsion. And that's what the Nazis had been trying to do to get Jews out of Germany throughout the 1930s. But nevertheless, the case remains that by the time the war actually erupted, and certainly by 1941, the push to mass shootings in the Soviet Union, and of course the extermination camps in Poland, those unfolded, those evolved in a fairly organic fashion, largely having to do with the way the SS was prosecuting the war behind the lines. That gets into a whole debate among Holocaust historians about the origins of the final solution. But I would say that if people were to look back at what Hitler was saying in public in the early 1930s, he was saying some pretty vicious things about needing to solve the Jewish question radically and permanently. And even during the peacetime years, when he was still running for office in the 20s and as far as late as 1939, he was saying things in public about, quote unquote, annihilating the Jews. So if Hitler's taken at his word, and many intentionalist historians, as they're called, say that you can see Hitler foreshadowing the final solution in his public pronouncements throughout the 20s and 30s, then you, of course, should take people literally when they speak. So if somebody campaigns on a certain agenda, they shouldn't be seen as just spouting rhetoric that they'll backtrack from immediately when they get into office, but they should be taken seriously. I think that's what we would call playing it safe. Whether that pertains to our present-day political situation in terms of things that President-elect Trump has said and hasn't retracted, or has said and then immediately retracted, and we can go through the litany of things that are of concern to people across the spectrum. I think the jury's entirely out as to whether anything he says is something he actually wants to pursue, or whether he'll be somebody who delegates all the policymaking decisions to his cabinet, to the Republican Congress. It's impossible to say. But I certainly agree that testing somebody's ideas by looking at what they've said in public on an issue or two or three, that certainly makes sense.
So maybe we have time for one more question, then I want to conclude with a wrap-up question for Dr. Rosenfeld. So do we have any additional? Okay.
Let me. Maybe I'll tell the question and then we'll translate it into normal English.
Okay, that's okay.
Well, so if one person will call other person publicly as a thief or corrupted and so on, there is a reason to sue this person, yes? And you may even charge a huge money for that and so on. But on the other hand, it's quite possible to call anybody who doesn't agree with you, Hitler, fascist, and so on. Yeah. What's the current system in this country? Is it quite normal for him to sue a person for the insult like that if somebody will declare you as a fascist.
So this is interesting. The question is, it's almost, is this tantamount to if you call someone a fascist or a similar type of analytical term, is it libelous? Can one sue for that? Are there any protocols for that? It reminds me, Dr. Rosenfeld, that I read, and I don't know whether this was actually, this got so bad in Israel, and there's a whole subset of how people in my own Jewish community make these analogies, which is, probably a whole nother webinar. But it got so bad in Israel that I believe the Knesset, it either introduced or passed, I don't know what the status of it, but a couple of years ago there was actual legislation to ban Nazi analogies in speech in Israel. But I guess this may we'll answer that question as well, and it kind of leads to my last concluding question.
Right. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer or a legal historian or anything, but from everything I know, in this country, freedom of speech tends to trump pretty much everything in terms of making one vulnerable to libel suits and so forth. I mean, if you look at every president in the country, starting with Nixon probably, LBJ as well. I mean, I've been doing research on a project having to do with the fear of a Fourth Reich emerging in the post-war period. And while that's always been a fear focusing on Germany, if you look at how student radicals in the 1960s in America were attacking the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, as, latter-day Hitlers, latter-day fascist regimes, latter-day Fourth Reichs in the making, if every time a student radical or a Tea Partier invoked the Third Reich in reference to our administration, if we could sue people for that, it would have been done decades ago. So I don't think there's any real grounds because it's protected under political speech. And in terms of libel laws, I'm sure, Donald Trump has definitely said that he's going to be taking a lot of people to court for different things over the years. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the suits either never came to pass after they were threatened or they were settled out of court. So even though Kellyanne Conway recently said people are going to have to watch what they say because we're, in a new administration, I have pretty substantial faith in our, free press and our laws and our legal system to keep those kinds of remarks flowing freely. Whether that's a good thing or not is a whole different question, of course. But I don't find that there's going to be any vulnerability on that count.
Actually, I think we have time for one more, and then I'll. Okay, going once, going twice.
Well, I guess
okay, yes.
Quickly, there's the question of Nazi analogies, and then there's also the issue of Nazi behavior. The kinds of things that we've, at least making the Sig Heil sign at the alt-right meetings, and more overt references that seem to go beyond just analogy, right? To a more seeming embrace of that ideology, at least from certain sectors of society.
So, yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't know if you heard it. When do we go from an analogy to behavior? The Sig Heil signs at alt-right rallies or even Trump rallies, and actual, emulating behavior, and that, of course, that relates, I think, also to proven uptick in hate crimes that we've seen against a variety of different groups, Muslims, Jews, immigrants. So when does the analogy part end and really confronting the behavior part begin? I think
right. Well, I think it's undeniable that there are plenty of examples of people displaying blatantly neo-Nazi, white supremacist, pro-KKK, blatantly anti-Semitic gestures in public, and that dates back all the way really to George Lincoln Rockwell in the 1960s, about which I published a piece in the foreword today, which you might mention to your group later. And frankly, the neo-Nazis marching in Skokie in the late 1970s, and the White Aryan Resistance getting their compounds together in Idaho. I mean, all of those kinds of demonstrations that have taken place in America, admittedly on an exceptional basis in recent decades, those are all part of protected speech. So my position has always been, those rallies, when they take place, need to be met with counter rallies that are 5, 10, 20 times the size, and that the media portrays the people who are advocating those positions for what they are, which is far right-wing extremist Nazis. And as long as we still in America believe that to be a Nazi is a bad thing, I think we'll be in good shape. I think the problem is when you see in Eastern Europe today, some countries are now starting to rehabilitate the fascist era, whether it's in right-wing Hungary, whether it's in the Baltic states, where anti-Soviet, pro-Nazi people have now been rehabilitated. That's when you start really getting into some dangerous territory, because then to be a Nazi isn't a bad thing, it's to be a loyal nationalist. So I'm not so much worried about slipping away from analogies to actual behaviors, because I think those behaviors objectively exist in certain pockets of our society, and when they come out into the open, everyone sees them for what they are. But it's incumbent upon the media to not use euphemisms to describe them. As you probably saw in the New York Times today, there's this whole AP question of, should the alt-right be used as a term to describe these Nazi types, which sounds somewhat politically correct, a nice euphemistic way of describing them to, make them seem not so threatening, and that's their own preferred self-designation. When all said and done, these are white nationalists and Nazi types. We probably should use those terms to make that clear.
So thank you. The last two questions actually lead to my concluding question, which is we've had this conversation. We have a situation in our country now, and also globally, as you referenced. Eastern Europe, also gains that far right parties are making in places like France, the Brexit issue. What do we do with this? What are action steps? How should people address this issue in their day-to-day, political lives? I would say, is this something I don't know if I don't think it's necessarily wise to police speech necessarily, but you did say in your opening comments that we have this generation now dying off of Holocaust survivors. The actual witnesses are now transferring the memory to us and to the next generation. So, for me, it becomes very crucial that we get this history right. Mm-hmm. But what do we do with this when we see the prevalence in pop culture, as you addressed in your book, Hi Hitler, as we're researching here at Augsburg, and in terms of political discourse, you see this happening more and more, this normalization. What is the best response to this phenomenon?
Great. I mean, that's another massive question. All I can say is maybe 2 points in terms of short-term and long-term solutions. In the short term, obviously, anytime people use the Nazi past in an abusive or manipulative way, there needs to be a response. So, for example, the Russian ice skating duo that just did their routine in Holocaust in concentration camp uniforms, and I think the female ice skater was the wife of one of Vladimir Putin's chief advisors, and this caused an enormous outcry. And it's good that the ADL and other community groups have called this out, and not to permit it to just go unremarked, because then that really does make something socially acceptable if people don't protest. So that's the easy thing that I think, especially in a world of social media, people can call attention to things that are beyond the pale and make sure that they don't get normalized, because if we don't have something beyond the pale as a concept, well, then everything is going to be included in the realm of the acceptable and the normal, and then things that are ultimately quite deviant are going to become acceptable, and that's obviously, we have to keep the lines very firmly drawn. The other point I simply would make, as far as a long-term solution is concerned, is a much more kind of traditional, and I don't want to call it vulgar Marxist or materialist perspective, but these eccentric ideas about the Nazis are always going to be with us. It's just a question of what staying power they're going to have. And most people who have jobs and are gainfully employed and have their family lives to worry about, they don't bother flirting with these kinds of ideas. It's when people tend to become desperate and resentful and gravitate to ideas that they hope will improve their lives, that they become more potent. And I think that the larger point, of course, is that it's very easy to take liberal democracy for granted. But once the economic basis of liberal democracy gets undermined, and after people haven't gotten wage increases for 30 years, and after opioids start becoming prevalent and communities break down, they become susceptible to extreme ideas in ways that they otherwise would never pay attention to in more stable times. So, partly that's a plea just to have a more, I guess, redistributive economic policy in the country, and to not make sure that all the tax cuts go to the wealthiest and wages are cut, as our new president says, they're too high and so forth. So, there's a way of diminishing the potency of extremist ideas, and usually that follows along the restoration of some kind of economic stability, some greater degree of egalitarianism in society. But I'm not the first person to recognize that that's a pretty tall order over the long haul. But I still think that's where we need to go.
Well, with that, I think that's a very important way to conclude. And certainly, you've given us a lot of food for thought on a lot of issues. And on behalf of Augsburg College and the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship, we also have had some support from the Jewish Community Relations Council, Chaim, which is a Child of Holocaust Survivors organization, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. We also have a similar center here in St. Cloud State. All have expressed interest in this topic, and I know that we'll be, you've energized us and given us a lot of food for thought to continue our conversation about this important topic here in Minnesota. And I hope this can serve as an example for others who are grappling with these issues across the country. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Rosenfeld, for your time, your generous time with me over the last year and today, and preparing for today. And we hope that we can continue our conversations with you as we move forward in discussing this issue. So thank you again. And I want to thank everybody for being here, and folks who may be watching a live or a rebroadcast of this. I want to thank everybody for your interest and for tuning in today. So from Minneapolis, thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks, Frank.